The night before Challenger launched, a group of engineers in Utah spread their charts across the table and tried to stop it. They were not guessing. They had the data in front of them, and the data said one thing: do not fly tomorrow. They lost the argument, and the reason they lost it is the part that still matters 40 years later. The engineers worked for Morton Thiokol, the contractor in Utah that built the solid rocket boosters, the two long white cylinders strapped to the side of every space shuttle. Those boosters were not built in one piece. They were built in segments, stacked and joined, and every joint had to be sealed. The seals were rubber rings, called O-rings. A rubber ring is a simple thing. Under pressure it squeezes into the gap and closes it. But rubber has a property that matters enormously here. When it gets cold, it gets stiff. Stiff seal is slow, and in a rocket booster, the seal has milliseconds to move before the pressure of ignition finds the gap. An engineer named Roger Boisjoly had been raising this for months. He had seen the evidence on boosters recovered from earlier flights, scorching where there should have been none. The colder the launch, the worse the damage looked. He had written it down. He had put it in a memo. The concern was on the record inside his own company. Then came the forecast for the morning of January 28, 1986. Overnight temperatures at the Kennedy Space Center of around 18 degrees Fahrenheit. That is roughly -8 Celsius. It was the coldest forecast in the history of that launch pad. The engineer's position was specific: below 53 degrees Fahrenheit. They could not certify the seals. Even by mid-morning, the pad would still be well under that line, and this launch was already behind. It had been delayed repeatedly. Weather, hardware, a stuck hatch handle. Each slip drew more attention to a program that had promised America routine, reliable spaceflight. There was a teacher assigned to this crew. There were classrooms across the country planning to watch. The pressure to fly was not written down anywhere, but everyone in the process could feel it. So on the evening of the 27th, a teleconference was called between the contractor in Utah and NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center. Boisjoly and his colleagues presented their charts. Their recommendation was a formal no. Do not launch. What happened next is documented in the public record of the Presidential Commission that investigated afterwards. NASA pushed back on the recommendation, and Morton Thiokol asked to go off the line, to take the discussion private among its own managers. The engineers stayed in the room while their own management caucused, and in that caucus, the recommendation was reversed. Inside that caucus, according to the Commission's record, a senior vice president turned to the executive responsible for engineering and told him it was time to take off his engineering hat and put on his management hat. It is one line, said in a private room, in the middle of the night. It is also the clearest description anyone has ever given of how this kind of decision actually gets made. The managers polled themselves. The engineers were not asked to vote, and the man who had been holding the engineering position changed his. When the line came back up, the contractor's position had changed. Morton Thiokol now recommended proceeding with a launch. Here is what the Commission found about that reversal. It was not driven by new engineering data. No fresh analysis had appeared in those minutes. Nothing had been measured, tested, or discovered. The data had not changed. The recommendation had. The next morning, ice hung from the launch tower. The shuttle lifted off at 11:38. 73 seconds later it was gone, and 7 people were dead. Millions of American schoolchildren were watching live because a teacher was aboard. In the room in Utah, the engineers who had spent the previous night arguing watched the same broadcast. A presidential commission was convened. It took evidence in public, and Roger Boisjoly told it exactly what had happened in that teleconference. He described the caucus that reversed his team's recommendation as an unethical decision-making forum. He said it under oath, about his own employer, in public. The commission's conclusions were damning, and they went beyond one cold night. They described an organization that had come to treat warning signs as normal. Damage kept appearing on earlier flights. Nothing catastrophic ever happened, so the damage stopped being a warning and quietly became an expected condition. There is a name for that pattern: the normalization of deviance. One member of the commission, a physicist, made the point in a way nobody could argue with. On live television he took a piece of the same O-ring material, squeezed it in a clamp, and dropped it into a glass of ice water. When he pulled it out, the rubber did not spring back. The entire technical argument, months of memos, a night of charts, sat in a glass of water on a table, and took about 10 seconds. It is the reason engineers still study this. The failure was not that nobody knew. The failure was that everybody had slowly agreed to stop being alarmed. And now the part almost nobody knows. What happened to the man who was right? After he testified, Roger Boisjoly was shunned by his own colleagues. The man who had tried to stop the launch became the problem in the building. He eventually resigned. He described the years that followed as a period of ostracism and depression, and he found himself effectively blackballed from the industry he had spent his career in. He could have disappeared. Instead, he spent the rest of his life traveling the country, speaking to engineering students and professional bodies about exactly one subject: what to do when you have the data, and the room has already decided. The American Association for the Advancement of Science gave him its prize for scientific freedom and responsibility. He died in 2012, aged 73. He never got the launch stopped, but he made certain that every engineer who came after him would know the argument had been made, by name, on the record, the night before. So tell me in the comments, if you had been in that room, and the decision had already been made above you, what would you have done?